24th of January 2025, and it is exactly 60 years ago today that Winston Churchill died. So we really are commemorating the 60th anniversary of his death. And as he was born end of November 2000, of his death, and as he was born end of November 2000, we have just celebrated in Britain the 150th anniversary of his birth. So this means that the subject is very topical and explains why there have been programmes on TV about Churchill. Some of you may have seen some of these programmes. And you can, if you're interested, you can see various programmes about the state funeral of Winston Churchill. There are many short or longer videos on YouTube telling you about the state funeral, which took place on January 30th, 1965, and many other videos about Winston Churchill. There is an international Churchill society, and they have lots of information too. So I have tried to compress his 90 years into a reasonably short presentation. So a lot of things I will not go into any detail about. So, please excuse me if I'm not going into great detail. As I mentioned, I used the book, the biography. Also, again, it is quite interesting. During his life, he wrote lots and lots of letters. He exchanged 1,700 letters with just his wife. And then he wrote to his children, he wrote to his friends, and they all wrote. So there is a lot of information out there in the archives. So some of the things you can actually see, some of the letters in the museum in London, the Churchill Museum. Off we go then without further ado. So we know that. Let's move on. So I've introduced myself. Okay, there he is, the man, and we have his dates: 1874, 1965. I've already said that. I will move on. I wanted to remind you all that when he was born in 1874, Queen Victoria was on the throne. 74, just 2 years before 1876, when Queen Victoria was proclaimed or self-proclaimed Empress of India. So this was the British Empire at its Blenheim Palace, and that's where he was born. And he's buried in a churchyard in a village called Leyden, which is also very close to Oxford. So we in the Grenoble-Oxford Alliance, we feel that we have a particular interest in Winston. Even though for some very curious reason, most of the archives seem to have ended up in Cambridge, which I think is a little unfortunate, but what is being handed out is the transcript of not the whole speeches. The speeches are very long, but I chose a couple of extracts from his very famous speeches. So if you want, you can actually follow the rule of check. This will be towards the end of my talk, but it's just to help you follow. I gave the title of this talk as being Puissance Fidèle, because I think that everyone, that is, people who do not necessarily agree with everything that Churchill did. So this includes his political opponents. They all agree. There's a unanimous sense of agreement that here was a man who did have the gift of the gab. He could talk. And he gave speeches, lots of speeches. There are collections of speeches. He gave speeches throughout his life, and he put a lot of work into preparing these speeches, learning them by heart. So here you have it, Blenheim Palace, near Oxford, where he was born in 1874. Very grand, one of the few, or maybe even the only dwelling place which has the title of palace, even though it does not actually belong to the royal family. And I just wanted to give you this information that the palace was built for the first Duke of Marlborough. Queen Anne, who was on the throne, gave money to the first Duke of Marlborough to say thank you for winning this battle, the Battle of Blenheim, which is situated now in Germany, where it was a defeat of the army of Louis XIV. And they were very pleased with him for achieving this victory, and gave him, I don't know how much money, so that the first Duke of Marlborough had built this palace, and since then it has been owned by the various Dukes of Marlborough, but you can go and visit, even though it's rather expensive. So Winston's father was Lord Randolph Churchill, who was also a member of Parliament and a minister. Notably, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. So that was on the father's side, and on his mother's side, sorry, I seem to skip the mother. I'll come back to the mother in a moment. The grandfather was actually one of the dukes. He was the 7th Duke of Marlborough. So Churchill was not a Duke because his father was a younger brother. And as you know, titles are transmitted to the first of the children at the time. It had to be, of course, a male. But he was born at the palace, and he was continually in contact with the other members of this family, notably his uncle and then his cousin Charles. And here is his mother, Jenny Jerome, who was actually American. She was an American of a very wealthy family. And so some people have suggested that because he was half American, that he did retain a particular interest for the United States. And we will see he visited the United States quite frequently. As a little boy, at the age of 7, he was sent away to boarding school. This is probably, even now, typical of the upper classes who send their children away to boarding school, even though they are rather young. And later, at the age of 13, he went to Harrow, a very famous public school, and of course you all know that a public school in English is not public at all, it's private and very, very expensive and very exclusive. So here he went until he was 18 virtually. Now, apparently he was not particularly outstanding as a pupil. In the book that is doing the rounds, we have comments from his school reports saying that he should really work harder. I think basically he was full of ideas, very imaginative, and he found the discipline of school rather difficult. And also in his letters to his parents, he seems to have been rather lonely. And in his letters, he says, oh, please come this weekend, or please come and see me. But his parents seem to be constantly traveling or busy, and so I think, especially at the first boarding school, he was rather lonely and sometimes a little bit unhappy. I felt quite sorry for him when I was reading some of the letters. So after Harrow, the public school, Harrow, he then went to Sandhurst, which is a sort of military academy in order to train to become an officer in the army. And we will see that this is one side of his career. I think he had several different careers going on at the same time. So, as a soldier, his first participation in a war was in South Africa, and I'm talking about the Boer Wars. There were two, and he went to South Africa, he went to the Sudan, and he was in India as well. So he did participate actively in military campaigns. And in his letters, he seems to have enjoyed the excitement of being participating in a battle, and he really wants to make an impression, to be seen to be a courageous soldier. And of course, when he's taken prisoner in South Africa and manages to escape, well, this is wonderful because he's talked about in the press. And almost immediately, his second career as a writer, journalist, will get started. He writes an account of his adventures in the Sudan, in South Africa, in India. And first of all, they're published in newspapers, and later they're published in books. And it becomes, over the years, it becomes a source of income. He makes money out of publishing these stories, these books, these memoirs. And as he has a taste for the good life, he enjoys the best of things. And he says that a salary of an MP doesn't go very far. So by publishing books, and he publishes a lot, he does manage to supplement his income, and this allows him to have a rather grand lifestyle. There are a certain number of myths surrounding Churchill, and I will mention a couple of them as I go along. He claims, or rather he claimed later in life, that he didn't believe in sport, he didn't go in for sport at all. But I didn't know this, I discovered that, contrary to popular belief, at least when he was younger, he was something of a sportsman. He was a champion fencer when he was at Harrow and then at Sandhurst. He was a very good rider, and again, this was important. And he swam, he loved swimming, especially in the Mediterranean, especially when his wealthy friends let him stay in their villas in the south of France. And he enjoyed swimming virtually all his life. So the sport, I think it was just a way of saying something about him. So we've seen the writer, we've seen the soldier, and he was something of a journalist as well. He travelled to a number of places, notably to Cuba and the US when he was a young man, and he wrote accounts in the newspaper of what he saw. It seems that it was in Cuba that he picked up the cigar habit. And so a lot of the photos that you can see in the books I have passed round show him with the famous cigar in his mouth. And these reports of what was going on in Cuba when he was there was an uprising against the Spanish, and he writes these stories and sends them to the press, and the press publish these stories. So he's making a name for himself, he's getting himself known. However, for him, the most important role that he was to play in his life was, of course, in politics. And he went into politics from an early age. He was 26 when he was first elected to Parliament as a Conservative MP. His father was a Conservative, he was a Conservative as well. However, again, I think it's important to stress, he was a Conservative, but he didn't necessarily agree with his party's policies on various things. And we will see him changing his mind, going from one party to another. I think it's because he was very much an individual, and he wanted to be able to defend ideas, whether they were in the interests of his party or not. So this brings me to another point about the myths. His critics said he was a political opportunist. He changed parties because he wanted to advance his own career. I am not convinced about this. He made himself unpopular by going against the party. He often was criticised by the party. And I quote one of his remarks about choosing a middle way between capitalism and socialism. He did not like the idea that you have to be either in favour of capitalism or in favour of socialism. He thought you should take the best from each ideology and produce something else. This did not necessarily serve him well, but this I think was why he changed parties and was why he got into trouble with his own party as he went along. So, very early on, he left the Conservative Party and went over to the Liberals. Why? Because the Conservative Party promoted tariffs. They promoted protectionism. And Churchill was against tariffs, protectionism. He was for free trade. Free trade was the main option, the main policy of the Liberal Party. So he went over to the Liberals. Yes. Well, it doesn't matter. I can still talk about. And we can see that very quickly he started to get important posts in the Liberal government. So he became, first of all, president of the Board of Trade. And again, when you look at his speeches, he was very socially conscious. He did defend the rights of working people. He defended trade unions. He defended reduced working hours. He was not this sort of conservative, elitist minister that we might imagine. He was very definitely trying to combine the best of both parties. And, sorry, I went too quickly there. And he ended up being Home Secretary. Home Secretary, the equivalent is the Ministre de l'Intérieur, which is an important position in government. So I've now got as far as the First World War. So in 1911, he became First Lord of the Admiralty. His background as a soldier, having been at Sandhurst, having participated in various wars, meant that this was a sort of an appropriate place for him to act in Parliament. However, his place during the First World War in government came under criticism because of this particular episode in the First World War, which was the defeat of an attempted invasion of Turkey. And when you read about it in detail, it seems to me, not that I'm a military specialist or anything at all, but it seems to me that why there was this defeat, this fiasco, which led to thousands of troops being killed or injured, there seems to have been a lack of communication between the army and the navy, with the navy wanting to do something and the army saying, well, we don't agree. And the result of this was a catastrophe and a loss of life. And because of the criticism, he is forced to resign. And what does he do when he loses his post in the government? Right, he says, well, I'll go off and fight. I'll fight on the front in France. So he participated then in some of the battles in France during the First World War. So when he came to war, he did know more than most ministers, I think. And when most people had forgotten about the Dardanelles fiasco, he then was made Minister of Munitions, which will, I think, be quite helpful later when he comes back in charge of the government during the Second World War, to know that, yes, it's all very well to have soldiers and sailors and Air Force men, but they've got to be properly equipped. So this is a taste of how to prepare for war, which will come in quite handy later on. I will go quickly here because it deals with the ups and downs of the coalition governments after the First World War. We can see a couple of the positions that he occupied here. Ministry of Colonial Secretary. He was interested in the colonies I talked to you about about the empire. But there are things that he mentions in his speeches, in his articles, in his letters, that made me think he was really very interested, not just in the fate of his own country, but in the fate of other peoples or various minorities. And when I read about what he said about the Kurds in Iraq, or the problem of what will happen to the Palestinian Arabs if a Jewish state is set up, and he was interested in all this back just after the First World War. It makes me think that a lot of things he was concerned about, he was right to be concerned about them. So we have a defeat in the elections in 1922. And I mention this because for 2 years he was not in the Houses of Parliament. But when you compare that with the 60 years that he was in the Houses of Parliament, you realise that this is a very sort of minor incident. It's a sort of hiccup in his long career. The 1920s in Britain and probably in France too, a period of upheaval, a period of difficult social questions. And we have a different coalition government this time. This time it's Labour, the Labour Party with the Liberals. Now, Churchill maintained a kind of wariness. He was a little bit wary about the Labour Party. And when this coalition was set up in 1924, he said, I don't want to be part of this coalition. So what does he do? He goes back to the Conservatives. I would like to mention the general strike of 1926. I want to mention that because during the general strike, which I won't describe in any detail, but one of the starting points was the miners' strike. And actually, Churchill was a supporter of the miners who wanted to get extra money. They wanted to have their salaries increased. And Churchill tried to convince the mine owners that they should make some kind of a gesture towards these miners. But unfortunately, nobody took any notice of what he said. Now, this period, 1929, 1939, all the biographers and experts all say this is a period of the wilderness. He's in the wilderness. Yes, if you mean that he did not occupy a position of authority in the government. He was not in the government at that time. He was what we call in English a backbencher. He was just an ordinary MP. But having said that, he's not someone who will sit back and sort of keep a low profile. And he's constantly making suggestions. And I just gave you, I think, an example from 1934, where this is just 1 year, we have 20 speeches. The speeches are very long and quite detailed. And 50 articles that he wrote on all the issues he thought were important at the time. So maybe he's in the wilderness in the sense that maybe he's not playing an obviously active role. He's not sitting back and twiddling his thumbs. He is constantly telling the government, well, what about this, what about that, what are you doing about this? And of course, as I have put up here, his fellow MPs really thought he was a nuisance and should keep quiet more often. I think throughout this period, this 10-year period, we can see that he was constantly going against what the party wanted, or even sometimes against public opinion. The first instance I mentioned is the question of the independence of India. The government of the time started to put forward plans to give self-government to India, and Churchill is hostile. Now he says it's because he doesn't want to have an India governed by a Hindu majority trying to impose its will on the minorities, whether that the Muslim minorities or the Sikh minorities. To some extent, of course, he was right. But I think also there was this nostalgia for earlier periods of the empire, and of course, as you know, India was always considered a jewel in the empire, the most important of the colonial states. So he went against the grain in India. More surprisingly, he also found himself in a very small minority as far as the question of Edward VIII marrying Mrs. Simpson, and I'm sure you've heard the story. She was a twice divorced American lady. Edward, who normally should have become king, he did become king, but I don't think he was ever crowned, says he wants to marry this woman, and the government of the day, a conservative government, no, and in the end he abdicated. Churchill did not want Edward VIII to abdicate. Again, what are the reasons? Various reasons: loyalty to the crown, you don't interfere, perhaps the American side of him. Perhaps he would, but in the end, he was probably wrong, because I'm not so sure that Edward VIII would have been the perfect king for the Second World War, as I'm sure you know. And then, of course, Munich. 1938, the Munich Agreement, in which the French and the British together made this agreement with Hitler, and Chamberlain, who was the British Prime Minister of the time, came back from Munich waving his piece of paper and claiming that he had brought peace to Britain. From early on in the 1930s, Churchill had warned his fellow MPs, but also in the press, everywhere he was saying, we're going to have a war. Germany is rearming. Hitler is not going to respect any peace agreements. He visited Germany in 1932, and he starts warning very, very early on. But people don't want to hear that message. They don't want to hear that a new war, a fresh war, is going to get started again. They just sort of, only 20 years since the Great War, the First World War, they don't want to hear this. So he is making all these declarations, warning people, saying we have to be prepared, we have to rearm, don't sign an agreement. This is just going to lead to a disaster. But unfortunately, Nobody really listens to him. And in the book that gives all the dates of all the decisions made, you realise that Chamberlain, just sort of a couple of weeks before Poland is invaded, Chamberlain still believes that there's not going to be a war. He gets it completely wrong. And when eventually war is declared, then a new movement is afoot to get rid of Chamberlain and have Churchill in charge. Because suddenly people think, well, he was right, we should have listened to him. But unfortunately, it was a bit late. And he, first of all, is given a role in the war cabinet. He is very good at organising things. He's very motivated, very, very determined. And the pressure builds up on Chamberlain to resign and putting it off, and well, we'll wait a bit longer. But eventually, on the 10th of May, so that should come up in my next one. The 10th of May, he does become Prime Minister. And we spend a little bit of time talking about him as Prime Minister during the war. Again, he has his critics, of course. Everything he did was not wonderful or right. But even the critics will agree that his role, his speeches in particular, during the Second World War were very important in making people believe that they could somehow survive, that they will not give up. So he did inspire people, I think. Now, I hope that we're going to be able to listen to this speech. Shall I try to stick it and see if it works?
I think it works.
Okay. This is the speech that takes place just after the evacuation of Dunkirk. So it's a pretty sort of, well, it's unfortunate having to evacuate 300,000 troops, but they do manage to do that. So they're not entirely negative. So ideally, we will listen to two speeches. I think we won't have the third one. The first one, as I just mentioned, is the speech that he made just after the evacuation of Dunkirk. And this is when he speaks about their finest hour. What he's saying, of course, is that in June 1940, things were looking pretty grim, and so the idea of being able to carry on the struggle, he says that in times to come, it will be remembered as their finest hour. And the second speech, with a bit of luck, don't forget, is the very famous speech, which is the speech that he made just after the armistice was signed between France and Germany. So that's a time, if you think about it, when the United Kingdom was completely on its own in this war. France has been defeated. We're going to have to wait another 18 months for the United States to join the war, and another year before the Soviet Union joins the war. So this is the famous wish. As well as making these very dramatic speeches in Parliament, but also on the radio for the citizens of Britain and other countries. Churchill travelled a lot during the war, and I found this very astonishing, that he crossed the Atlantic several times during the war when ships were being sunk by German submarines, where planes were being shot down, and to cross the Atlantic during the Second World War, it would take sometimes 18 hours in a plane, and sometimes they had to go on a sort of diversion to avoid being shot down. And here he is, he's not young at this point, yet he keeps travelling backwards and forwards. In the beginning, because he wants to convince Roosevelt to join the war effort. As he keeps going there and he keeps making these speeches. And he goes, of course, to the US, but also travels in Egypt, Morocco, Turkey as well. Then, once he has Roosevelt up and going, then he has to start thinking about negotiating with Stalin. This was not easy either. So he travels, he explains in the book that he travels into Moscow, he goes to meet Stalin, who refuses to travel very far. So it's Churchill who does all this backwards and forwards, traveling here and there to meet Stalin. And perhaps I'll put that on my next one. Oh yes, he also goes to see the troops. He goes. For example, he is in North Africa. He's in Italy, and he goes and he sort of tries to motivate them. They're getting a bit fed up. They need a little bit of inspiration, a bit of courage. So he goes to see that. So he constantly moving all the time, very active. The end of the Second World War is complicated, notably, of course, because of his relations with, his relations with Stalin. And here again, you can see how he doesn't give up, trying to convince Stalin to allow free elections in Poland. He's constantly defending the countries of Central Europe and trying to get Stalin to come to an agreement. It's interesting, when Stalin dies, he thinks, this is 1953, we've got a new leader, I'll try and get him to be a little bit more flexible. So he does go to great efforts to negotiate with Stalin, but to no avail. Then, of course, we have the very famous general election of 1945, in which the Conservatives are defeated. And I know from talks with my husband here that people felt that this was somehow a lack of gratitude on the part of the British public to vote out the Conservatives under the leadership of Churchill. However, I think there are some very good reasons to explain why Churchill, as leader of the Conservative Party, was defeated in those elections. And I tried to put together the reasons. Reason number one, I think, was this idea of Churchill's was that there should be a coalition government. As I said, he didn't really like having one party in control all the time. He wanted to get a coalition going. And the Labour Party refused to be part of the coalition, so that was one, I think, reason. Also, when you read his campaign, I think in his campaign, the election campaign of 1945, I think he made mistakes. He talked about the dangers of socialism in Britain, and he had this very unfortunate remark about the Gestapo, which I think really did shock a lot of people. Of course, you have to remember, after his dealings with Stalin, and having seen that Stalin's promises to allow free elections, notably in Poland, I think his vision of socialism was very much influenced by what he'd seen in Central and Eastern Europe. So to focus on the dangers of socialism, suggesting that it would lead to some kind of tyranny, I think was not a good idea at all. And also I think that after 6 years of war, I think the British public wanted to look to the future, wanted change. Now there had been changes that had been started during the war in favour of social progress, the National Health Service, educational reform. And I think the Labour government focused on that, saying, well, we will go further, we will offer more social protection, we will do more for ordinary people. And that is why I think, oh dear. He is then voted out of Parliament. Well, no, he still remains an MP, but he's no longer Prime Minister. We have a new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, who is in power for 5 years. The post-Second World War period is very difficult for Britain because the economy is completely shattered. There is a lot of new building and everything goes wrong. So after 5 years, the Conservative government comes back and he is back as Prime Minister, doing another 5 years as Prime Minister. I don't think that his second mandate as Prime Minister is quite so interesting as the first one, although of course he does speak a lot and we can't, for various technical reasons, hear another famous speech, which is the Iron Curtain speech, which I think you have on a piece of paper, when he warns about the dangers of the totalitarian system embodied by the Soviet Union. And he introduced this idea of the Iron Curtain, cutting off all these major European cities from the rest of Europe, and he mentions them all at the beginning of the speech. Warsaw and Budapest and Vienna, etc. So he's very much interested in his second period of office in defending Europe. And I noticed that one or two things that I didn't really know. He was a big supporter of European defence community. He was in favour of a European army, which would include Germany. He had all kinds of ideas which, unfortunately, he wasn't able to put into practice. I'm getting towards the end of his career now. One thing I would like to mention is his Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953. Throughout his whole life, he was writing and publishing. And he got the Nobel Prize for Literature. I think I wrote it down somewhere, but I can more or less remember what I put, for his mastery of work as a historian and a biographer. He wrote biographies of his father, of the first Duke of Marlborough. He wrote his history of the First World War, of the Second World War. And we're talking volumes and volumes here. And of course, I mentioned all the other stories that he wrote. I tried to count the number of published books. I couldn't count accurately because the collections of speeches, I couldn't work out exactly how many were sort of actually reproducing similar speeches. But there are at least 40 books, at least. And how many speeches and other newspaper articles, I couldn't tell you. And in the Nobel Prize ceremony, he is also credited with his gifts of being an orator in the cause of universal values. And I think probably that's the most important, his defense of democracy, of liberty, etc. It is said, I don't know if this is true, it is said that he would have preferred to get the Nobel Prize for Peace. And he did spend a lot of his time backwards and forwards, writing articles, making speeches to defend the rights of countries to make their own choices. And I think he would have liked that. He didn't go to Stockholm to pick up his prize. Lady Churchill, his wife, went in his place. And of course, by now he's getting rather old, and he has a number of illnesses. He has strokes, he gets pneumonia, so he's not in the best shape. And eventually, Lady Churchill convinces her husband that perhaps he should step down, which he does in 1964 when he's coming up to the age of 90. And then on the 24th of January 1965, so he just sort of retired really, he dies, and a few days after there is the state funeral which is organized in St. Paul's Cathedral with thousands of, or hundreds of thousands of people lining the streets. If you watched the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth, then you get an idea of what kind of thing was going on. There were kings and queens and dukes and various dignitaries of that sort. Many, many heads of state, including, of course, Charles de Gaulle, were there, and it was a very, one of the rare occasions when somebody who's not part of the royal family is given such a funeral. And the attendance of the Queen was also very unusual. I didn't know this. But apparently she does not attend funerals for commoners. So, but she was there as well. So I would have liked very much to show the video that Philippe sent as a conclusion. I don't know how to do it, although
the second speech.
Yes.
From 18th of June 1940, the same day as de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle, made his speech in the BBC. And I know that there is some fighting between de Gaulle and Churchill. And they were of the same opinion, but they fight sometimes. They were not the same opinion.
Yes. They did not always see eye to eye, for obvious reasons. Obviously, de Gaulle, his main priority was to get rid of the German occupation in France. He was essentially centered on the fate of France. What I've tried to suggest is that Winston Churchill was obviously wanting to defend his own country, but he was also interested in all kinds of other countries. At one time he would be sending supplies to Stalin, and another point he would be doing something else somewhere else. And so perhaps it wasn't always easy for him to agree to the requests made by de Gaulle, because the resources were limited and had to be shared. And of course, when you have to share resources, it's not always very easy. But they did have, I think they both had a great deal of respect for each other. And de Gaulle was certainly there for the funeral. And I think Churchill did respect him. He said he was a bit of a nuisance at times, he got on his nerves, but he respected him.
Mais du coup, il y avait déjà l'apartheid au moment où il est mort, je crois.
Oui,
il était en place.
alors en ce qui concerne son opinion quand il était Premier ministre ou même un peu après, je n'en sais rien. En revanche, ce que je peux dire, c'est que juste après la Deuxième Guerre contre les Boers, donc c'est une victoire pour les Anglais, il a dit très clairement qu'il ne fallait pas traiter les adversaires trop durement. Il était pour la réconciliation. Déjà avec les Boers, ensuite il a mis en garde contre le traitement des Allemands après la Première Guerre mondiale, de nouveau après la Deuxième. Il a dit que voilà, un vainqueur doit savoir respecter, au moins ne pas vouloir écraser complètement son adversaire. His private life, when he was married to the same lady for all his life, and I said at the beginning, they exchanged letters all the time, 1,700 of them. We can't say the same. And they seem to be very close. Having said that, I think also that at times Lady Churchill would go off on cruises in the West Indies. So they weren't necessarily together all the time, but certainly when you look at the letters, they were very close, and she seems to have been of great support to him. I didn't mention either, because as I said, he did have problems with depression. He went through periods of great depression, and I think Lady Churchill helped at those times. Of his children, he had one daughter who died young. He had one daughter who committed suicide. His one son, I think, was a disappointment to him, and he tried. Difficult, isn't it, when you've got a very famous, very successful father, to go and try to have a career in politics. He was not a successful politician, his son, and I think he only managed at one point to get elected to Parliament because somehow it was arranged that there would be no candidates standing against him. It was not really very glorious. So he does say in many of his letters that he realizes that he was not at home, perhaps, as often as he could be, because he was just traveling all the time. And another thing I didn't mention, which I should have mentioned, was that he painted. He found painting was a way of overcoming depression. And there are apparently 500 paintings that some have been exhibited in various galleries. One apparently was bought by the actress Angelina Jolie for several million pounds, and that was resold quite recently, and she made profit apparently. I don't think that he was a great painter, but he enjoyed painting, especially when he was on holiday in the south of France. He painted a lot, and I think it did help to get over the depression, take him out of politics for a while. And he did like, of course, he had a house in the country, and they did spend time gardening and doing up a house in the country.
Do you have some example of his British humor?
Yes. Can you repeat the question, please, for the people? Can you repeat the question? The question was, I didn't realise it was still. Yeah. The question was, did I have examples of Winston Churchill's sense of humour? He had a wicked sense of humour. I'll give you a couple of very short examples. one lady said to him, if I were your wife, I would put poison in your coffee. Which he replied, if you were my wife, I would drink it. On another occasion, another disagreement with another lady, and the lady said to him, but you're drunk, Mr. Churchill. And he replied to her, yes, but you are ugly, and tomorrow I will be sober. he could be rather cruel. Just a couple of examples, but there are lots. I can't necessarily remember them all. But he did have a way with words. Are there any other questions or comments? Yes?
Is it true about his cat naps? Just sleeping 10 minutes during the war?
I think probably is true. That he did have these naps. He was. I think it must have been very difficult to work with him because he was sort of full of energy. He wanted things to be done immediately, and he called for his secretaries or whoever sort of odd times of the day or night, and he would give dictation when he was in the bath apparently, and it can't have been easy. And I presume that he must have had these short naps. Otherwise, how did he carry on? I mean, the constant travelling backwards and forwards and speech making must have been exhausting, as well as having a number of health problems. So it is probably true.
Well, the story is that he didn't go to bed. That he went
did
through the
go-
war
he
just
did
with a few
that.
cat
Well,
naps.
he did go to bed. He had a bed in the underground place in London, but he didn't actually sleep there very often. He didn't like sleeping down there. Apparently, he sometimes went up to the top of the building to watch the bombers coming in during the Blitz to see where the bombs were landing. But, he did sleep, but probably not as much as he should have done or could have done.